The weight of the golden statuette in his hands felt both familiar and foreign. Adrien Brody stood in the chaotic backstage area of the Dolby Theatre, the bright stage light still burning in his memory, the echo of applause lingering in his ears. His name had just been called, and he had walked onto that stage once more, but this time, for a film unlike any other he had done before. The Brutalist had been a labor of love, a role that had demanded more from him than he ever expected. As he clutched the Oscar, his fingers unconsciously tracing its contours, he felt an overwhelming mix of emotions: relief, gratitude, exhaustion. The journey to this moment had been long and arduous, shaped by months of physical, emotional, and intellectual immersion into the world of a man whose story mirrored the struggles of so many yet had remained untold for too long. A journalist approached, microphone in hand, her eyes gleaming with anticipation. The question came swiftly, inevitable yet profound. What did this award mean to him? Brody exhaled slowly, his mind racing through the past months of preparation, the endless hours spent poring over architectural blueprints, studying post-war European history, dissecting the mind of a man who built beauty from rubble. Winning an Oscar was an affirmation, not just of his performance but of the story itself, the story of an immigrant, an artist, a visionary. It had pushed him beyond his limits, forcing him to inhabit the psyche of a man whose ambition was both his salvation and his curse. He had felt the weight of that struggle, the loneliness of creating in a world that often refused to see the value in art. The role had demanded everything from him, stripping away his comfort until all that remained was the raw, unfiltered truth of a man devoted to his craft. As he tried to put his emotions into words, he found himself returning to the quiet moments on set, the early mornings spent refining a single gesture, the late nights lost in the mind of a character who had once been merely a name on a script but had become someone real, someone who had changed him. This Oscar was not just a recognition of performance, it was proof that the work had mattered. That the sacrifices, his own and those of the character he portrayed, had not been in vain. The transition from celebration to reflection was almost seamless. With the golden statuette still firm in his grasp, Adrien Brody found himself drawn into a deeper conversation about the intricate process that had led him to this moment. The journey to the Brutalist had not been a simple one. Unlike previous roles, where transformation often relied on physicality or psychological depth alone, this character required something more, an immersion into an entirely different world, a mindset shaped by history, culture, and the relentless pursuit of artistic legacy. His preparation had begun long before the cameras started rolling. The story of a visionary architect navigating the ruins of post-war Europe and the harsh realities of America's immigrant experience demanded an understanding far beyond the lines in the script. It required a knowledge of structures, not just physical ones, but the invisible ones that defined identity, belonging, and the sacrifices necessary for creation. Brody had thrown himself into the study of architecture, his days consumed by blueprints, structural theories, and the philosophy behind modernist design. He devoured literature on Bauhaus principles, fascinated by the movement's defiance against ornamental excess, its pursuit of function over form, and the ideological struggles embedded in its foundations. He studied architects who had left their homelands in search of artistic freedom, men who had seen their dreams dismissed, their work misunderstood, and their personal lives eroded by the weight of their vision. To embody the character fully, he went beyond books and lectures. He sketched obsessively, filling notebooks with lines and shapes that mirrored the character's internal chaos, sharp angles, unfinished structures, the skeletal remains of dreams yet to be realized. At first, his hands were untrained, his lines clumsy. But over time, he began to understand the mind of a creator who saw the world in steel and concrete, in shadows and light. He visited historical sites, walking through abandoned buildings where the ghosts of the past still lingered in cracked walls and shattered windows. He stood in the cold halls of forgotten masterpieces, running his fingers over the raw textures of concrete, imagining the hands that had shaped them decades before. But it wasn't enough to understand architecture. He had to understand the architect, the man behind the drafts and designs, the immigrant whose hands carried both dreams and despair. That was the true challenge. To replicate the isolation that defined the character's life, Brody withdrew from the world. He spent weeks alone, avoiding the comforts of modern distractions. He lived in a sparse, dimly lit space, where the silence stretched endlessly and the walls felt more confining than liberating. The loneliness became palpable. He let the weight of his solitude settle into his bones, mirroring the quiet desperation of a man who built monuments yet struggled to find a home within them. Physically, he reshaped himself. His character was not just a man of intellect but of labor, a builder, a craftsman who understood the physical toll of his creations. Brody trained his hands, forcing them to work with materials foreign to him, feeling the exhaustion of sculpting something from nothing. He adjusted his posture, his movements becoming deliberate, each step carrying the burden of a man who had spent his life bending steel to his will yet could not mold his own fate. The emotional toll was even greater. He absorbed the immigrant experience, reading letters from displaced artists, tracing their journeys from homeland to exile. He studied their loss, their longing for what had been left behind, the struggle to be seen in a country that often refused to acknowledge their brilliance. He found echoes of his own past roles in their pain, but this was something different. This was not just a man fighting for recognition, this was a man fighting for survival, for a space where his existence could be more than a fleeting moment in history. By the time filming began, Brody was no longer merely acting, he was inhabiting. His mind had shifted, his perspective altered by the very process of preparation. Every line he delivered, every structure he envisioned within the film felt lived in, as though he had walked those same streets, labored under those same burdens. The transformation had been complete long before the camera started rolling, and in that moment, holding the Oscar in his hands, he knew that the work had not just shaped the character. It had shaped him, too. The weight of a film never truly leaves an actor, especially one that demands transformation beyond performance. For Adrien Brody, The Brutalist had been more than a project, it had been a revelation, an intimate confrontation with themes that had lingered in his subconscious long before he stepped into the role. Now, standing backstage, still clutching the Oscar, he was asked what the film had taught him. It was a simple question, but the answer stretched far beyond the confines of a single conversation. Resilience was the first word that came to mind. The Brutalist was, at its core, a story of persistence, a man determined to carve his vision into the world despite every force working against him. It was about the quiet endurance of an immigrant, an artist, a creator who, despite rejection, despite displacement, refused to abandon his calling. Brody had always admired that kind of perseverance, but embodying it had reshaped his understanding of what it truly meant to struggle for one's place in history. Through the character, he had come to appreciate the fragile yet unbreakable spirit of those who build in the face of destruction. The architect he portrayed was not merely designing structures, he was creating meaning from the ruins of his past. The concept resonated deeply. Art, whether in architecture or cinema, had always served as a means of survival, a way to leave an imprint in a world that often sought to erase those who did not conform. The immigrant experience had been another revelation. His research had led him into the lives of those who had left behind everything familiar, languages, traditions, identities, only to find themselves in places that refused to acknowledge their worth. The role had forced him to internalize the loneliness of being unseen, the frustration of knowing one's value yet struggling to prove it in a landscape that often favored the familiar over the revolutionary. It was not just history, it was a reality that echoed in the industry he knew so well. Hollywood had never been an easy place for outsiders. Brody had felt it himself, even after his breakthrough, even after proving his capabilities. There were always unspoken barriers, an expectation to fit into a mold that often did not allow room for complexity. There had been times he questioned his place, times when rejection felt more like an erasure than a mere setback. But the Brutalist had reminded him why he had chosen this path in the first place. Art, at its most profound, was not about acceptance, it was about expression. The film reinforced the idea that true artists do not create for validation but out of necessity, out of an internal fire that refuses to be extinguished. The sacrifices were inevitable. His character had given up love, stability, a sense of home, all in pursuit of something greater than himself. And Brody had seen that same pattern in countless artists before him. He had seen it in those who devoted their lives to their craft, despite the uncertainty, despite the knowledge that recognition, if it came at all, might arrive too late. Stepping into that role had forced him to ask himself if he was willing to endure the same. The answer had been yes. Even now, as he stood with the industry's highest honor in his hands, he knew that the lesson of the Brutalist was not about the reward but the journey. It had been about persistence, about faith in one's own voice, about the courage to build something that might outlast time itself. It had been a reminder that art was never just about the artist. It was about what remained when everything else had been stripped away. The weight of the Brutalist had settled deep into Adrien Brody's bones long before the final scene was shot. Even now, standing in the glow of victory, the echoes of the film's demands still lingered within him. This role had not just challenged him, it had drained him, reshaped him, and at times, nearly broken him. There had been days on set when exhaustion felt unbearable, when the emotional gravity of the character made it difficult to separate himself from the man he was portraying. The silence of solitude, the weight of exile, the relentless pursuit of something just out of reach, it had all become his reality. His character had lived in a space of quiet suffering, and Brody had let himself fall into that darkness completely. The lines between fiction and reality had blurred. Long nights were spent in restless thought, consumed by the pressures of embodying a man whose entire existence had been a fight against obscurity. Inhabiting that mindset had come at a cost. Some scenes had required more than performance, they had demanded vulnerability so raw that it felt impossible to leave behind once the cameras stopped rolling. There were moments he doubted himself, moments when he feared he had given too much, or worse, when he believed it wasn't enough. One particular day on set had nearly undone him. The weight of the role had compounded with the grueling schedule, the demands of physical transformation, and the loneliness that had accompanied his preparation. As he stepped into a scene, one of loss, of desperation, something inside him collapsed. The emotions he had been carrying overwhelmed him, and suddenly, the distinction between the character's pain and his own disappeared. It had been an outpouring of grief that felt alarmingly real, and when the scene finally ended, he had needed time to recover, to remind himself that he was still Adrien, not the man who had suffered in silence for decades. The physical toll had been just as intense. The transformation had required not just adopting a new way of thinking but reshaping his body, his movements, his presence. His character had built with his hands, worked with materials that fought against him, lived in a body molded by years of labor. Brody had forced himself into that reality, training his hands to understand the weight of stone, the resistance of steel, the fatigue of relentless work. He had stripped away the comforts of modern life, choosing instead to inhabit a space of discomfort and austerity. There had been moments of isolation that had left him questioning everything. The long stretches of solitude had not just been a method of preparation, they had become his existence. He had let himself become distant, unmoored from the rhythm of his usual life, just to grasp what it felt like to exist on the fringes. It was one thing to act as if one were alone, it was another to truly feel it. Yet, despite the pain, despite the exhaustion, he knew it had all been necessary. The suffering had not been for nothing. Every moment of doubt, every tear shed, every hour spent in the depths of his character's mind had shaped the final performance. It had carved something real from within him, something that resonated beyond the screen. As he stood with the Oscar in his hands, he thought about whether it had all been worth it. He didn't need to hesitate. Every painful moment had led him here. And if the film had made people feel something, if it had spoken to even one person who understood that struggle, that perseverance, then yes, it had been worth it. As the interview neared its conclusion, the conversation turned to something broader: what lessons could be passed on, what wisdom could be distilled from this experience. Adrien Brody, still holding the Oscar for The Brutalist, took a moment to consider the journey that had led him here. There were no shortcuts in this craft, no easy paths to something meaningful. The roles that mattered, the ones that left a lasting imprint, were the ones that demanded everything. For aspiring actors, the greatest advice he could offer was to embrace discomfort. It was in the most difficult, most vulnerable moments that real artistry was forged. Comfort bred complacency, and no story worth telling had ever been born from safety. It was the willingness to inhabit the unknown, to step into the skin of someone far removed from oneself, that separated a performance from a transformation. He spoke about the importance of choosing roles that challenge, of seeking stories that demand introspection. The industry often valued spectacle over substance, but real impact came from depth, from the kind of storytelling that left audiences changed in some way. The roles that lingered in the mind and heart were not always the most glamorous or the most celebrated at first, but they were the ones that held truth. And truth, in the end, was what defined a career built on authenticity. Looking ahead, he hinted at future projects, but without specifics. Right now, he didn't want to think about what came next. This moment, this film, it had left its mark on him. He wanted to breathe it in, to sit with the weight of what it had meant. Not just the award, but the work itself, the experience of inhabiting a character so deeply that it had reshaped his own understanding of perseverance, of creation, of sacrifice. In many ways, The Brutalist had reminded him of The Pianist, the film that had first brought him to this stage all those years ago. Both roles had demanded an emotional and physical surrender, an immersion into a world of loss, survival, and resilience. In The Pianist, he had embodied a man stripped of everything but his will to endure, finding music in the silence of devastation. In The Brutalist, he had portrayed a man whose art was his legacy, whose vision outlasted the hardships that sought to break him. Both had been stories of survival, not just in the literal sense, but in the way art and identity could persist through even the most unforgiving circumstances. Standing here now, with the weight of another golden statue in his hands, he understood more than ever that true artistry was not measured in accolades. It was measured in the willingness to lose oneself in a role, to give everything for the sake of a story that deserved to be told. And in that sense, he had never felt more fulfilled.